Greetings, everyone, from the International Labor Organization's Cooperatives Unit, where we are celebrating our centenary this year, 2020. And on this occasion, we have been conducting a series of interviews with cooperators from around the world who have worked with the ILO. And today we have the pleasure of hosting Edgar Parnell, a lifelong cooperator, cooperative practitioner. Welcome, Edgar. Thank you for joining us today for this interview.
Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be among the participants in this exercise.
You have started working with cooperatives at a very young age, and in fact, it even runs in the family. Can you tell us a little bit about your first exposures to cooperatives?
Yes, well, I think I've told people before that the reason I ended up working in a co-op store goes back to the days when my father was an errand boy at the local cooperative shop. In those days, there weren't any restrictions on children, only except in factories. So I guess as soon as he could ride a bicycle, he got this job delivering groceries to the members. And he'd been promised a job in the shop, but unfortunately his father died. That's my grandfather, and he was only 12-year-old, but he had to go and earn money for the family, and at 12-year-old he went to work in the steelworks. And ever since that time, he's always felt that his sons, he has two sons, and the eldest, would not work in heavy industry. And so while all my classmates were joining the steel industry and the chemical industries, I was directed towards the local co-op, and I got a job in the menswear department, and that's how I started. But I think, fortunately, in those days, we had a very good education system in the consumer cooperatives. So we got induction programs, then we had evening classes, and then we started our correspondence courses, which were called, you'd call them distance learning these days. And I spent 4 years studying by correspondence, and then eventually I got a scholarship to go to the UK's Cooperative College. So that's how I started. And of course, the thing about the Cooperative College in those days, it was at Sanford Hall, and it was a residential college. And one of the unique things about it is that we had students from all over the world, because a lot of the mainly post-colonial or were still colonial countries from cooperative departments, and we had other students from various people. In fact, I even remember, I think there was somebody who came on an ILO scholarship, was the head of the Taiwan Taiwan National Bank. He was the head of the National Bank, and he was sent on to that college. Anyway, the result of that was that I realized cooperation was an international activity, and I made a lot of international friends, and from that time on, I had a very broad view of what I wanted to do.
You worked then with cooperatives and other self-help enterprises, as you call them, self-help groups, wider social solidarity economy institutions, both in the UK but also internationally. If you could share some of those experiences with us.
Yes, thank you. The thing is, when I'll just make this point about the self-help enterprises, I actually first came across the term self-help organizations when I started to do some work for ILO. Mm-hmm. And the concept of all these organizations being self-help and mutual action based is really important to me. And I think there is a danger in watering that down because it's getting people to do things for themselves is really what is behind cooperative action. And as soon as we move into the area of patronage and benevolence at the heart of things, then it's not the same. But anyway, that's my view. But it was thanks to the ILO that I discovered that concept. I started work, as I mentioned, in menswear, but in those days we had everything: bakeries, funeral undertaking, all kinds of manufacturing, abattoirs. So we did everything in those days. So pretty soon I moved right across to different types of retailing activities. So I had all that schooling in the by correspondence, and I had to go for 2 years in the Air Force because it was national service in those days. And then I got back to retail cooperatives. But at that time, a lot of the cooperatives were struggling because they hadn't kept pace with the changes in retailing. And so most of my early years were what I call turnaround work, where you had to rescue failing cooperatives. And that was the kind of work that I did as in my 20s. And I did that in England. But then in 1966, in my capacity as a cooperative retailer, I was sent off to Bechuanaland because the Republic of Botswana was about to be born, and they had approached the UK cooperatives, consumer cooperatives, to find someone to help them with the particular need for setting up retail stores. So I went off to Botswana. At that time, it was just in the run-up to independence. There'd been many years of drought. Most people lived in poverty, and their neighbor, apartheid-controlled South Africa, had their eyes on the mineral wealth in that country. So a quick decision was made to grant independence, and that's when I was around. So it was exciting times. We had the first elections, and because there was such a high level of illiteracy, we had to go out, and we had little cards with the pictures designating the different parties, and you had to put it in the right box according to your wish. Anyway, it was very exciting times, and we set up a cooperative development trust, and that was part of the program, which in fact involved setting up 10 stores in each of the tribal capitals. But on top of that, there was the cattle marketing, which was very important, and the credit and savings societies and handicrafts. So Trevor Bottomley was the first registrar of cooperatives. He later became the head of education at ICA, and he set up the first cooperative law and the first cooperative department. And he was a brilliant educationist, and he had organized in all the villages with a lot of help from some other very capable people. And so it was all prepared so we could get the cooperative started in every respect. My job was to get the stores open. So that was my first experience overseas. Now, at that time, in the very same year, 1966, the ILO recommendation 127 came into operation. I remember us talking about it at the time, and I'm quite sure Trevor Bottomley was involved in introducing that into Botswana. But later on, after I left, the ILO had a very big program, and they set up a National Cooperative Development Centre. So a link back there. After I came back, I went first of all to work with independent footwear retailers and set up an interesting kind of cooperative, which was about sharing management information and getting the footwear retailers into mainstream high streets, and because a lot of them were still in this place where they had been cobblers' shop or even shoemakers. So it was a great part of the retail revolution. And then I went back to cooperative at the national level, what we call the CWS, which was, it's now the Cooperative Group. And I was one of a number of consultants which went round to help to often rescue the retail cooperatives that were getting into trouble. And then I went to Scotland, where a similar thing was happening. A lot of the retail societies were in trouble, and they were all brought together in a retail division. And I ran all the non-food stores in Scotland for quite a few years. And we built the first ever new department store in Scotland since the war. So again, it was all exciting stuff. But after that, I went back into international work. And that's when I went as an advisor to Jamaica, and that was for the British government's Overseas Development Department. And the intention was that I should try and revive the consumer cooperatives, because during the wartime, the government had promoted retail co-ops as one of the ways to deal with the rationing and the supply problems. As you can imagine, an island like Jamaica had a lot of difficulties. But as the war had gone and independence had come, they'd more or less disappeared. However, when I got there, the Prime Minister at the time, Michael Manley, had, I think, quite influenced by Castro in Cuba, had first nationalized a big chunk of the sugar plantations, and then it had been decided they would become workers' cooperatives. So I found, from being a retailer, I became a workers' cooperative person. And so we had to set up new rules. We had set up the different levels of organization, really designing a new movement. But it was a very ambitious plan, But of course, the big problem was that sugar is an international traded commodity. And in Jamaica, the sugar cane was still cut by hand, and they were competing with automated plantations. So it was, at the time, it was a wonderful program because there were so many people who came into the cooperatives and learned how to organize communities, and we worked with them, and a lot of them went on to do a lot of good work. But in the long run, it wasn't viable to have the sugar industry in Jamaica on that sort of scale. So that was my second sorry overseas. So I came back from Jamaica. I worked for a charity that worked with handicraft producers mainly in Africa, but then later they had groups of all parts of the world. And one of the things I did was set up an international retail store in the centre of London. So handicrafts from all over the world were available in the centre of London. So I worked with that, and then I heard they were looking for people to go to India in the ILO, and then I got an appointment to go to Calcutta, as we call it in those days, but now Calcutta. And there was also the headquarters in New Delhi, and then we have a unit in Chennai that used to be Madras, and so I used to work sometimes in Calcutta, Madras, or in New Delhi, and some of the other states. Myself and a Swedish colleague were based in Calcutta. So that was a very interesting and I might say a challenging project with a good international team. And the project involved training senior staff and mentoring those who were going to undertake a role as a consultant for their cooperatives. And the degree of involvement of government was one of the key problems. In the states that the government had a light touch, it was very quite easy to work, but it was quite difficult in the states where, in fact, the only people we were allowed to work with were civil servants. So it was, if you like, two sides of a coin. Some was very successful, some wasn't so. But it was a very ambitious project. So I was glad to have been part of it. So then I came back to the UK, and that's really when I would say I entered a second phase of my work when I went to the Plunkett Foundation. The Plunkett Foundation focused mainly on agricultural cooperatives, and in the UK, it was a kind of service organisation. So we collected all the statistics, we did the training, we represented them on a number of European bodies. So through that, I worked in Brussels quite a lot on different aspects of cooperatives at a European level. So I was working with the UK cooperatives, but we also had a long history at the Plunkett Foundation of working overseas, and we did a lot of training throughout the world, again, mainly with former colonial countries. And the bulk of the work that we did was training, but as things moved on, we were more involved in longer term projects. For example, in Egypt, we set up mobile training operations for the Egyptian agricultural cooperatives. So I spent quite a lot of time in Egypt, and some of the agricultural cooperatives were very strong and very, very powerful. So that was an interesting exercise. And the other things were, as time moved on, a lot of the former dominions, as we would call them in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, etc., like the UK, were getting rid of their government marketing boards. Now, for example, if we look today, we see the Scandinavian agricultural cooperatives are extremely strong, but because of the government involvement, we had very poor cooperatives in a lot of the countries. And so a lot of the work I did was in places like Australia, New Zealand, where we were trying to help the move over from government involvement. And of course, there's some very, very strong cooperatives in New Zealand, for example, which it was a pleasure to work with. So later, we became involved in post-communist cooperative with the cooperatives. I mean, in the sense, it started in Poland almost by chance. Margaret Digby, who was a well-known figure and was the what they used to call it, the secretary of the Plunkett Foundation in those days, she had worked for Stafford Cripps in the wartime government, along with this lady who was very formidable. And she went in, when she heard of everything was happening in Poland, went into Mrs. Thatcher's office and demanded that something be done about it. So as a result, I was sent to Poland almost after the first elections put the Solidarity into power, and I was working with the rural Solidarity. So that was again very exciting times. It was almost like independence in Africa. It was just a new start for everybody. And while I was working in Poland, and the Berlin Wall came down, and then when I got into the next stage, it was when Russia was looking at what they were going to do in their cooperatives, and we worked with the Cooperative University in Moscow, bringing in what I called market-based economics and retailing. We had several retail shops which we pioneered with them in different parts of Russia. And we worked generally with most of the Eastern European countries, but my own work was mainly in Poland and Russia. So that was Plunkett Foundation. While I was at Plunkett, I was co-editor of the Yearbook of Agricultural Cooperation, and I also wrote a book called Reinventing Cooperation, Challenge of the 21st Century, that became recommended reading in most universities that did cooperative as a subject, cooperatives as a subject. It was translated into a lot of languages, and I remember particularly Greek, Italian, and Korean and Russian as the more unusual words. Anyway, eventually I relinquished my post as CEO of the Plunket Foundation in 1998. I continued to work for the Plunket Foundation as a consultant, but I also started to do work for the ICA, and in those days, of course, they were both in Geneva, and so we had quite a lot of dialogue. Often used to go across the coffee in the ILO building, and we ended up by doing some work jointly with the ICA.
Mm.
So I finally stopped doing paid consultancy work, and I went as a volunteer to the Philippines in the Department for Agrarian Reform, which had a lot of work with cooperatives because they were the means of getting the farmers to get their stuff to market once they got some land. So that was the beginning of the third phase, which now, over the last few years, I've been looking back on my work to see what I can learn from it. And I've tried to document that and share it as best I can.
Mm-hmm. Across more than 60 years, Edgar, you've worked with cooperatives. Many questions from what you have shared. One that comes to mind is you worked a lot with retail cooperatives, and in the context of global supply chains that are more equitable, fairer, for producers, workers in the supply chain, and consumers. If you have any insights, for instance, retail cooperatives in the UK have close ties with fair trade, or there are some examples of establishing shorter supply chains between producer cooperatives and consumer cooperatives. If you would care to share your thoughts on that.
Yes, I think sometimes it's quite difficult to plan these things. They tend to evolve when you get the right kind of relationships between the people involved in the different cooperatives. If we look at the situation in most agriculture, they work well with large groups because they have to be able to guarantee supplies throughout the season, and so that there's a lot of scope for working between cooperatives. But again, it's not on any sort of ideological basis. The practicalities. A good example was goes back to when we were in Poland. We had a good cooperative in the UK which marketed a lot of onions, but they had in the winter season they needed to get supplies from different places, and then when they had big contracts with the major supermarket companies, they were able to work with the Polish growers to get continuity of supply, so that as far as having a kind of overall policy, I'm not quite sure you can do it that way. I think you've got to give the opportunity for producers and retailers to come together, and that equally applies with worker cooperatives who can work with the shops that are retailers. The other thing, of course, is the new wave, and Plunket Foundation has been heavily involved in this in the UK, is the retailing in rural areas, because the big supermarkets are not at all interested in serving the rural areas, whereas when the people come together, they can serve themselves. And in the UK in recent years, there's been more than 350 of these stores, and every one has been successful. And now they're also involved in pubs, public houses. So as the villages, once you take the village store and the pub out of it, the village dies. So that now these are all rapidly spreading the cooperatives at that level. And of course, then they come together and they have worked with the wholesale cooperative, well, the cooperative group to get supplies. So there's all kinds of, very practical things. As long as you can find a way of getting those people to meet and talk to each other. And I think, organizations which can facilitate that are badly needed. And I think there's a lot of work to be done there.
I think, the research around this is that whole facilitation, market facilitation aspect is a very, very important one. You mentioned in your time at the Plunkett Foundation, you work quite a deal with post-communist countries in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. How was it? What were the challenges of working on cooperatives in a setting where historically there was so much state control or imposition associated with cooperatives, and to transition to something that was more about member-owned autonomous institutions?
Yes, well, I think in Poland it was very obvious. I remember when the first time I went to Poland, the taxi driver cursed the cooperative shop when he went past it, the state dominated one, and he didn't speak much English, but I knew he was not very pleased. But the most of the work, we tried to get some involvement, and we worked with the people in the consumer cooperatives to try and help them convert away from the state, but it's really quite difficult to do that. We tried to get the retail cooperatives back onto being locally controlled, and some success was made, but I've not followed it up since. But the main work was with producers, because they were, unlike the rest of the communist Eastern Bloc, in Poland, they were never collectivized. The farmers all had their handkerchief-sized plot of land, and they had usually had one broken Soviet supplied tractor and another one which they used for spare parts, and that's how they kept going. So we didn't use the word cooperative very often in those days. We talked about producer groups and so forth. I think the world has changed a lot now, and they fully understand what cooperatives are now, or what real cooperatives are. And I think they've responded very well. But in the early days, when we started working in rural areas, because most of the change had taken place, obviously, in the shipyards and the heavy industry, we found that among the young people, that they'd got this vision that in the West, everybody had all these wonderful things that they wanted. And when I remember one of the first courses, they came up to me, some of the young men said, "When will we get our cars and our computers then?" And they were looking for these things. But to be fair, there was lots of very, I would say, very exciting people who were ready for the change. And in the agricultural side, they've really done very well in terms of organizing themselves. So, but Russia was a different story. But there was some good hope there, and a lot of good work was done. And in some of the regions, I think they are still doing reasonably well, but they've got a lot to contend with, I'm afraid.
You said that in your 20s you worked a great deal with failing co-ops, and then after you stopped working as a paid consultant, you have been writing a great deal about the rise and fall of cooperatives, the how and the why. If you would be so kind to share with us why do cooperatives fail?
Well, I think if we look at it, why do they fail? It's not so much that they fail, it's that they are, I would call mutate. They mutate from being an organization that is serving the members into an organization that either focuses on the wishes of a particular group of members, or more often than not, the management take it over. That is in the consumer end. And it's because they are prone to mutate. But it is something I've discovered on further research. It happens with so many other organizations, that organizations end up serving the people that run them day to day, rather than the real owners. And that requires systems to be in place to stop that happening. And I think the focus, a lot of focus has to be on training people to understand the different economic system that operates in cooperatives. And they talk about, a lot of our cooperatives still talk about profit, when what they really mean is margin. And once they start that kind of vocabulary, it's the thin end of the wedge, and it's getting really a kind of oversight in place. And the training and the education is absolutely vital, but it's got to be the right kind of education. And I'm sorry to say, a lot of what has passed for cooperative education really has been kind of a preaching, more or less trying to have a set of principles which are a kind of sacred text, where what they really is practical guidance on how to run cooperatives day to day, and how to make sure they remain under democratic control and serve their members. And that really is the fundamental change. But education is got to be, but we've got to start by educating the educators.
For more participatory, more engaging, more practical learning, both in contents and delivery. The world of work is going through great changes, technological, demographic, climate change, and now we are passing through a global pandemic that's shaking the world. What do you think is the role for cooperatives and other self-help, mutualism, and solidarity-based enterprises in this changing realm?
Yes, well, I think we have to say that, even before the pandemic struck the world, it was heading in a certain direction, and that, in my view, all this is going to accelerate things if we don't take steps to make sure that it doesn't. By that I mean is that the people who are going to make the decisions, and if they want to be committed to a democratic system, but I would even say, no matter what the form of government is, that if they're going to get people to deal with their own problems, they really have to start educating people at a very young age that they have this sort of cooperative idea, that they are not, how would I call it? It's all quoted there many times, but it is talking about self-reliance, self-responsibility, self-help, and mutual action. And it's getting the tools to do that. And I think the tools to me are a set of systems which make sure that if you follow those systems, then you are going to end up with a successful venture. If you simply try to borrow from commercial business and try to think that you can just carry on with an economic system which is based on profit maximization, then you're not going to get very far. But once you realize that we're talking about resource optimization right across the board, and it starts to tackle our climate change problems, our resource problems, and the whole range of things that we've got to address. But we've got to bring these two things together, a commitment of the people to do something themselves with the idea that you've got an economic system that actually serves the people, and it is something that serves the planet as well. And it's trying to get that into something that's a practical approach. And again, we have to think, in my view, we've got to talk about our organizations, our cooperative organizations, our self-help organizations. They're first and foremost intervening in markets in the best interest of the members. And that means getting the member a better deal, being a better organization, one that they can trust to always act for them, and always to be looking to the future. In other words, based on long-termism rather than short-term profit. So there are a set of approaches which I think can be very practical and very appealing, but we have to get better at teaching our people how to do that.
Edgar, I can't help but notice in your virtual background, you have a list of institutions that are based on cooperative and mutual values and operating principles. I see Energy Supply Co-op, Refugee Returnee Co-op, and worker co-ops, mutual insurance co-op. I noticed the cooperators co-ops, and I just wanted to ask you if you could share what are cooperators co-ops with our listeners and viewers.
Yes, well, I mean, I think what I'm talking about is second level cooperatives. In other words, once you have seen the benefits of working together at one level, then you look to see how you can expand that. And, you know, if we look at something as small as a small cooperative that collects milk from its producers, then it isn't long before they say, well, look, we need to process it ourselves. And then we have to add value by making it into cheese and yogurts. And so you see a very clear example with something like that. So that when I talk about these, if you like, cooperatives, then that's the kind of action that they need to take. But I think, again, it's trying to get the message across that this is part of the big, wider economic system. So that if we look at the problems we have, so many of them are because we've got big companies exploiting resources. And the only way we can see things changing is when people say, yes, well, we can do something ourselves. We don't have to rely on these big companies, but we have to start something now, and then we can get together and move on to the next stage, rather than thinking we can, go out and just replace Amazon straight off. But there's lots of things we can do now because of the technology that small groups can do. And, looking at supplying energy, it's not necessarily, big energy suppliers that are going to be required. It's combining the power of small generating groups together. So there's so many opportunities, but the trouble is, in most cases, our education doesn't even mention cooperatives and self-help. So we've got we come back to this big job. We need lots of people who understand what needs to be done and then are ready to get that into the education system.
And this is not only in cooperative colleges or universities, right? This can happen in law schools, business schools, for a number of different education institutions, levels, sectors, disciplines.
Yes, no, certainly at all levels. I mean, it's certainly in agricultural education. It's probably quite difficult to do it, to offer anything unless you're going to talk about producers' organizations. And I suspect that in agriculture, the agricultural training can very easily combine. And but as you look at all the other sectors, we have to get away from the idea that there's only one model around, and the profit motivated operation. But as I say, self-help has got to result in benefits, and it's not just a theoretical. People don't join a cooperative because they believe in it. They may stay there because they believe in what they're doing, but it's they have to see real benefit, and that to me is the key, is getting that message across. So I don't know, I didn't say much about my work directly with the ILO. Maybe I should mention a little bit about that.
Sure.
Because when I came to Geneva, as I mentioned, I was working first on the joint project which we had for cyber education, as we called it in those days, and we were looking at how we could work together with the ILO on this. But then I went on to work on the project which was dealing with the problems we had at that time, and I worked together with the office, the people in the headquarters, on the dealing with in those days particular problems of refugees and after the wars and so forth. But we seem to have a similar situation with the pandemic and what post-pandemic action. We may be able to get people to realize because it's always in times of need that the cooperatives come to the fore. And I think when the need is there, provided we've got the people to say, look, there is another way. So that's something we'd maybe revisit some of those ideas that we had.
In fact, we have created a crisis response through Cooperative's webpage just last month, and the publication you referred to is one of those. Among more recent work with refugee response through cooperatives, and even business restructuring in the context of bankruptcies, and how these could be transitioned, restructured into worker cooperatives. So there are a number of resources there, and your work then is among them and very relevant today. Yes.
Yes. No, that's good to hear. And I would like to mention, of course, the recommendation 193. I think I mentioned earlier that it was in 1966 when we had the first recommendation, and the 193, I had the privilege of working on that at the very first report to kick off the process. And so it was very interesting times. It had a long way to go after that initial report, which we prepared at ILO headquarters at that time. But I think it's a good recommendation. Sometimes I get a bit annoyed that the developing countries seem to be the ones that people think need this recommendation, but all countries need that recommendation. And I think there's a very good example in my own country that we have a cooperative bank, and it's called the Cooperative Bank, but it is now owned by international investors. And that has happened because in the legislation, the word cooperative is not adequately protected. And that is the kind of thing that we need standards at international level. And we've got to be looking to see if we can get our politicians to take more notice of that recommendation, because it is important. But there's other work which is being done, and in particular are interested in accounting standards. I know the credit unions have done a lot of work, but there's really an important role for new standards in accounting, which need to be specific for cooperatives and self-help enterprises. And you see, this is one of the worries I have about including benevolent institutions and charities in this idea of social enterprise and social solidarity, is that if we don't focus on cooperatives and self-help as a group, you can't get standards that are going to fit all those other organizations because they're not the same. Self-help enterprises are quite unique, and they need unique legislation, and they need unique standards in accounting and in other areas too, the statistical data and so forth. So, you know, I think there's such a lot of work to be done, and I'm glad to see that ILO have made a start, and I just hope that you can get support at a political level so that the work really takes off. It's important.
Indeed, we have recently had guidelines on statistics of cooperatives adopted at the International Conference of Labor Statisticians in 2018. So operationalizing those is very much on the agenda now as well. But as you said, the support is very important. Political leadership support is very important. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences and thoughts with us, Edgar. And we can, of course, always continue reading your words and thoughts through Coop Pundit, and hope we meet again soon.
Yes, thank you very much indeed. I enjoyed speaking with you.